Hey, USSU students, today we're going to turn our focus to World War II in Asia and the Pacific. So after the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, they went about their business of completing their goals in the Pacific, of gaining more territory, more resources. They started gaining lots of quick victories over countries in the Pacific, and they began to started to threaten major countries like Australia and India. A major incident we're going to discuss is the Bataan Death March of 1942. And basically, the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippines. They invaded the Philippines, and the United States was helping the Philippines fight off the Japanese. But a month later, the Filipino forces had to surrender to the Japanese, and the Japanese took lots of prisoners, and they forced them on a 60-mile march through the jungle, and this became known as the Bataan Death March. It was called that because the prisoners of war faced starvation, disease, they didn't have enough water, they were out in the sun all day, and along the way, 5,000 Americans died on this death march. Some were killed by bayonet, some were shot, beheaded, or just left on the side of the road to die. Okay, so this is the Bataan Death March. So in 1942, it looked like the Japanese were doing well. They were conquering lots of territory. But 1943 is a year where the tide of the war kind of turned against Japan. So the U.S. Navy had regrouped and was starting to fight the Japanese in the Pacific through a tactic called island hopping. Now, island hopping is basically just moving from island to island to island, eventually hoping to make it to mainland Japan and conquer Japan. And this tactic was beginning to work, and the United States was able to push the Japanese back, island by island, back toward their home island of Japan. A group that played a major role in helping the United States defeat the Japanese in the Pacific was the Navajo Code Talkers. Basically, Americans needed a code to communicate with, and they needed a code that couldn't be broken. And so the Navajo language is an unwritten language, and it's very complex, hard to understand, and it's not written down anywhere where anyone can find it and try to decipher it. And so by using this language and by using these Native Americans, these Navajo Native Americans that could speak their home language, they're able to transmit messages by telephone and radio. And the Japanese had no idea what they were saying. They couldn't break the code. And so it was extremely helpful in fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. Okay, Battle of Midway, major turning point in the war in the Pacific. This was a huge victory for the United States. What had happened was the Japanese decided that they wanted to try to lure the American Navy into a place where they felt like they could destroy the Americans. And so they chose a place near Midway Island. But fortunately for the Americans, they had already cracked the Japanese code, and they knew this was going to be a surprise attack, and they knew they were being lured in. And so they had a plan, and they went in ready. This is where we have Admiral Chester Nimitz. He was basically over the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and he commanded the American forces at the Battle of Midway. Now, the Battle of Midway, the Americans were ready because they knew what the Japanese were going to do, and so the U.S. was able to destroy 4 of their aircraft carriers. So this basically ended their strength and gave the Americans the upper hand throughout the rest of the war. All right, the U.S. Army in the Pacific is commanded by this guy. His name is Douglas MacArthur. And they're using the tactic of island hopping, so moving from island to island. Ultimately, they wanted to make it to Okinawa and Iwo Jima, because from there, they would be able to strike Japan on their home island. And so they're ultimately trying to make it there. And so by 1945, American forces had taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Okinawa was an amphibious invasion, so it's very similar to D-Day in France. And these islands are super important because from there, now the United States is ready in 1945 to finally attack the Japanese mainland. So now I'm going to give you a little history of the atomic bomb. So we're going to start in 1939. Albert Einstein, probably heard of him, this guy right here. He sent a letter to President Roosevelt telling him that he thought Germany was developing an atomic bomb. And so in 1942, FDR sends a group of scientists to New Mexico where they develop and explode the world's first atomic bomb. This was July of 1945. Germany had already been defeated, so the bomb wasn't going to be used on Germany. But America was preparing to invade Japan. And so the idea was starting to get kicked around, do we use the atomic bomb on Japan or not? So FDR was reelected for a fourth time, so only president in history to be elected more than 2 times, and he was actually elected 4 times, but he died all of a sudden in April of 1945, right before Germany surrendered. So he didn't actually see the end of the war. President Truman saw the end of the war. But Germany is now surrendered, and we're trying to decide how we're going to deal with Japan. It's summer of 1945. So Truman, who becomes president after FDR dies in office, he's afraid of attacking mainland Japan because the Japanese, he knows, will fight very hard, viciously to defend their home island, and he doesn't want to lead more Americans into battle that are going to die. There are estimates at the time that it would take 1 million American lives to invade Japan. And so Truman decided to use the atomic bomb on Japan rather than risk more American lives and extend the war. So his targets, he decides he's going to target centers of Japanese military production. So it's Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so the first bomb, August 6, 1945, they drop it on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later they drop it on Nagasaki. Overall, 230,000 people were killed in both explosions combined, and Germany surrendered after the second explosion. Now there's people that say they shouldn't have dropped either bomb. They should have just dropped on an uninhabited island to show the power of the bomb and see if they surrendered first. Or you bomb one city and then give them a chance to respond, but we bomb the second city only 3 days later without giving the Japanese a chance to assess the damage, realize what was going on, and surrender. So there's lots of critics looking back after the fact on this. There's people that side that we should have and that we shouldn't have. Is still a controversial issue today. This is a picture of the Enola Gay. This was the bomb. This was the plane that dropped the atomic bomb, first atomic bomb. Here's Hiroshima completely leveled from the atomic bomb, and here's Nagasaki. So just like in World War I, in World War II, there's new technological advances. Lots of historians attribute the victory to these new technological advances. So we've got radar. So radar uses electromagnetic waves to detect a moving object's range, altitude, direction, so that they can find and track airplanes in the sky. Sonar, you can track submarines underwater. Code breaking, the Allies understood the Japanese codes, but they couldn't understand our codes. You've got the proximity fuse, which is an explosive device that, as when it gets close to the target, it just explodes. So you don't have to hit exactly; you just have to get close. You have to get close to it, and then it will explode. And then antibiotics, so used for the first time during war. So when soldiers are wounded and they get infections, you're able to treat these soldiers' wounds with antibiotics. And then jet and rocket engines, so you've got faster aircraft and able to do lots of different things. Here's a few statistics that you should know about World War II. So U.S. soldiers, we lost 292,000 soldiers killed in battle. 672,000 are wounded. There's over 100 million military personnel fighting in the war. So this is the largest war in history. You've got more than 70 million deaths worldwide, so very destructive. And if you look at the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they lost 230,000 people Compare that to the amount of soldiers the United States lost in the war. It's very close. So that's just how destructive just those two bombs were. And then in this war, the majority of people killed were civilians. So it's a deadly conflict specifically for civilians. So it's not just military people being killed, it's civilians in cities, especially here in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So now that the Germans have surrendered, the Japanese have surrendered, the Allies are going in, liberating Germany, and they're finding all of these concentration camps, and they're discovering what has happened during the Holocaust. And so in 1945 and 1946, the Allies put the Germans on trial in their own country, in the city of Nuremberg, and it's called the Nuremberg Trials. And they put them on trial for crimes against humanity. That's what they accused them of, because of the atrocities that were committed by the Germans during World War II and during the Holocaust. And so these Germans, they're defending themselves. They're saying that they had only followed orders. They had been told to do that. They were ordered that by their superiors, and so they had to. But still, the fact is many were still found guilty of committing the atrocities. Many were hanged or put in jail. And so what this shows us is that throughout history, individuals are going to be responsible for their actions even in times of war. So you can't say that you were just following orders. You have to do what's right, or you're going to be held accountable and held responsible for those actions. And that is what's demonstrated with the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946. And after the war, Germany also was denazified. So we had the denazification of Germany, and Germany is divided up. So it's divided up into 4 zones. So the U.S. gets a zone, Britain gets a zone, France gets a zone, and the Soviet Union gets a zone. The 4 main allies each take and occupy one zone of Germany. And what they did is they went in, they tried to explain to the people why the Nazi beliefs were evil and wrong, and they tried to educate and introduce people to this idea. And then Germany was divided up by different countries, and the goal is to try to recreate a Germany that would be an international partner and not a menace to the world. So they're going to try to change Germany, make them into a world ally and partner. Japan was also brought into control, under the control of the United States after the war, and General MacArthur was assigned the task of rebuilding and reforming Japan. And so the United States made changes in Japan to make them less aggressive. And so they took away their overseas empire. Their leaders were put on trial and punished. We made them agree not to use nuclear weapons or wage war. They were forbidden from having a large army or navy. And they had to create a new constitution that went into effect in 1947, which turned Japan into a democracy.